Tobias Redmond hadn't spoken to another soul in 8 years, not since the night everything he loved was taken from him in one violent breath. His days blurred into each other, marked only by the rising sun, the steady sound of hooves, and the creak of worn leather beneath his calloused hands. He didn't mind the silence. In fact, he had built a life around it. The horses didn't judge him, and the wind didn't ask questions. Out here on the edge of nowhere, silence had become sanctuary. The old cabin stood like a forgotten monument on the hillside, half swallowed by wild grass and time. Tobias moved like a ghost inside it, eating, working, mending what little needed mending, always listening, always alone. He had no calendar, but he knew exactly how long it had been since he'd buried his wife and daughter. Not a day passed that he didn't remember the weight of the shovel, the feel of dirt hitting pine. Solitude wasn't a punishment for Tobias. It was protection, both from the world and from the man he used to be. That night, the wind roared through the canyon like a wounded animal, tearing through the trees and slamming against the shutters with a fury that even the horses felt. Rain fell in sheets, thick and hard, drumming the roof like war drums. Tobias sat in the dim light of the fireplace, hunched over an old saddle bridle, restitching leather that had cracked with age. The storm had locked the world outside in chaos, but inside his cabin was steady, controlled. That's why the knock hit him like a rifle shot. It wasn't the timid rapping of a neighbor. He hadn't had one of those in years. It was raw, urgent, the sound of someone running from death. For a long moment, Tobias didn't move. The bridle hung in his hands, forgotten. The knock came again, louder this time, cutting through the wind like a scream. No one came to his door. No one had dared in nearly a decade. Not since he'd made it clear, through cold eyes and drawn rifles, that Tobias Redmond wanted nothing to do with the outside world. Every instinct he'd sharpened in the silence flared to life. The way a man who'd survived too much trauma recognizes danger before it speaks. He remained frozen in his chair, eyes on the door as if it might suddenly explode inward. His mind raced, replaying the only other time he'd heard knocking like that, frantic, late at night, right before blood soaked the floorboards of the life he once knew. Back then, he'd opened the door without thinking. Back then, he still believed in decency. That mistake had cost him everything. The storm outside pounded harder, and with each gust, memories surged like floodwaters. He wasn't afraid of dying. He feared repeating a choice that had once carved his soul in half. Slowly, his hand moved toward the fireplace mantel, toward the rifle that had gathered dust, but never lost its deadly promise. But before his fingers touched the stock, something strange happened. He heard voices, multiple, layered, muffled by the wind and wood, but unmistakably human, and one voice rose above the rest. It wasn't English, but it wasn't unknown. Tobias's blood turned cold as the syllables reached his ears. Apache. That language had not touched his cabin in years. Not since Sarah was alive. Not since the world made sense. The last time he'd heard that tongue, it was through the songs his wife would hum as she braided their daughter's hair. Before the raid, before the betrayal, before the bodies. The memories that came with that language weren't just painful, they were dangerous. His pulse quickened, not with fear of the storm, but fear of the past clawing its way through his front door. Apache voices meant only one thing to him: trouble. And yet, the tone didn't match the terror he expected. It wasn't defiance or threat. It was pleading, desperate. As if someone out there believed he still had something human left in him. That shook him more than the thunder. The voices were soaked in pain, not anger, and Tobias wasn't sure which scared him more. The voice grew clearer, closer, no longer just a shadow behind wind and rain. "Please, we know you're there. We need shelter just for tonight." The words were spoken in English, but shaped by an accent rough as riverstone, deliberate, careful, like someone who had learned the language through necessity, not choice. Tobias pressed his hand against the door, feeling the vibration of her voice. He hadn't touched that door handle in years. Not for anyone. His instincts screamed at him to stay still, to wait, to let the storm do what it would. But something in that woman's voice cracked a part of him he thought had turned to stone. Maybe it was the way she said please. Maybe it was the truth carried in the tremble between syllables. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the way her voice reminded him of Sarah Strong, but fraying at the edges. The bridle fell from his lap as Tobias stood up, unsure whether he was answering a knock or chasing a ghost. His fingers brushed the heavy iron bar across the door, a barrier that had held back more than weather. It had held back grief, and the world, and everything in between. Tobias paused, his heart beat like hooves on hardpan. 8 years, 8 long years without opening this door for anyone. And now the world had found him again, pounding on the wood like it had a right. The knocking came again, harder, urgent. Desperation laced every strike. From outside, the woman's voice called again, clearer, sharper. "They are coming. If you don't help us, we will die out here. And when they find our bodies at your gate, you will die, too." Tobias's hand hovered over the locking bar. There was no fear in her words, only certainty. And in that certainty, something shifted inside him. The old Tobias, the one buried under years of silence and sorrow, opened one eye. The iron bar groaned as he lifted it, fighting against rust and memory. His hand trembled slightly, not from age or weakness, but from knowing what this choice meant. You open that door. You invite the storm in, not just the one outside, but the one waiting behind every memory, every scar. The cabin was no longer silent. The wind roared, the rain screamed, and somewhere beneath it all, he thought he heard hooves distant, but approaching. Tobias knew better than most what that meant. The men chasing those voices weren't far behind, and if they were who he suspected soldiers or worse, they'd be close enough to smell the smoke curling from his chimney. When the bar finally dropped free, the weight of 8 years seemed to crash to the floor with it. The door creaked open, protesting like an old wound. What Tobias saw would follow him for the rest of his days. 10 Apache women huddled together on his porch, rain pouring down around them like judgment. Their dresses, once traditional and vibrant, were now torn, stained, and clinging to bodies that bore wounds both fresh and old. The youngest of them, barely more than a child, clutched something wrapped in a soaked blanket. It moved, a baby, pale-lipped, near lifeless in the cold. The oldest among them had hair streaked with silver and eyes like glass worn down by too many tears. But it was the woman who stood slightly apart who held his attention. Blood ran from a cut above her eye. Her shoulder was exposed through a torn sleeve, and yet she stood with her chin raised, her gaze steady, daring him to look away. She was not afraid. Not anymore. Tobias didn't speak. He couldn't. Not when his throat had closed around the weight of everything she carried in that one silent stare. "I am Ayana," she said, voice firm despite exhaustion. "These are my sisters, my daughters, my people. We have been running for 3 days." Tobias opened his mouth, but no words came. Questions pressed at the edge of his tongue. Where had they come from? Who was chasing them? Why his ranch? But the answers were written across their faces, in the way one woman held her broken arm, in the silent tears streaking down another's mud-covered cheek. The baby whimpered, barely audible, but the sound broke something loose in him. Some things matter more than answers, more than caution, more than solitude. And maybe Sarah had been right, all along. Maybe kindness was what kept a man from becoming something hollow. "Come in," Tobias said, not recognizing his own voice. And like shadows, they moved past him, graceful, grateful, and carrying the storm inside with them. As the last of the women stepped through his door, Tobias suddenly realized how small his home really was, not in size, but in spirit. For 8 years, it had been his fortress, his cage, his penance. But now, with these women inside, it became something else entirely. The scent of rain followed them and mixed with blood and fear, and the faintest trace of hope. They filled the room without saying much. One crouched near the fireplace, trying to warm frozen hands. Another sank against the wall, cradling the baby, who let out a weak cry. Ayanna was the last to enter. As she passed, she leaned in, voice low but sharp. "The soldiers who hunt us are not far behind. Maybe an hour, maybe less. They will not stop until every one of us is dead." Tobias closed the door and slid the bar back into place, but he knew it was meaningless now. The storm wasn't outside anymore. It had crossed the threshold with them, and nothing would ever be the same. The storm outside still howled, but inside the cabin, something quieter and more unsettling had begun to stir. Tobias stood motionless for a long while after sliding the iron bar back into place, his hand still resting on the cold wood of the door. Behind him, the room had changed. What was once a hollow sanctuary of silence now pulsed with unfamiliar life. The soft rustle of wet fabric, the muffled whimpers of a child, the low, tired breathing of people who hadn't slept in days. Tobias turned slowly, surveying the space as if seeing it for the first time. The fire, which had burned low, now cast long shadows across unfamiliar faces. The women had spread out instinctively, some near the hearth, others pressed against the walls, eyes watchful, backs never exposed to the windows. They didn't talk much. Survivors rarely did. Tobias felt the air tighten around him. The cabin hadn't shrunk. It had simply filled with the weight of stories too heavy to speak aloud. Ayanna stepped forward again, her presence commanding even in exhaustion. She didn't sit, didn't lower her eyes. "The soldiers," she said softly, "are not far behind. An hour, maybe less." Her voice wasn't panicked, it was precise, matter of fact, like someone who had lived too long with death to fear it anymore. Tobias nodded slowly, the words settling in his gut like a stone. He walked to the window and pulled back the corner of the curtain. Rain still fell in thick curtains, but the edges of the storm were beginning to fray. That meant visibility would return soon, and with it, the hunters. How many, he asked without turning. Ayanna's answer was grim. 8, maybe 10, all armed, led by a man named Morrison. That name landed like a hammer in Tobias's mind. He knew Morrison, or men like him, uniform polished, soul rotted, drawn to violence like vultures to carrion. It made sense now why the knock at his door hadn't sounded like war. It sounded like people running from it. He turned away from the window slowly and looked at her. Really looked. Ayanna wasn't a beggar. She wasn't a victim. She was a leader, carved from loss and held together by willpower. And yet, even in her steadiness, Tobias saw the quiet plea beneath the surface. Not for pity, not even for safety, but for a choice, a chance. "Why are they hunting you?" he asked, his voice low, the question cutting through the heavy quiet. Ayana hesitated just long enough to show the pain wasn't rehearsed. Then she spoke. "Because we ran instead of dying quietly. Because we chose to live when they expected us to fall to our knees. Because when they came to our village and killed our men, some of us chose to fight back." She looked toward the girl holding the baby, then back at Tobias. "And because one of their officers will not see morning if we live to tell what he did to my youngest sister." The silence that followed her words was deeper than before. Tobias felt a coldness settle in his bones, one that had nothing to do with the storm. He'd heard stories like this before, back when he still wore spurs for men who claimed to protect peace but left ashes behind them. He knew the kind of officer Ayana was talking about, the kind who took what they wanted and silenced anyone who dared to speak afterward. There was no misunderstanding in her words, no room for doubt. This wasn't about stolen horses or mistaken identity. This was about covering up a crime too monstrous to see daylight, and now those responsible were closing in fast, determined to bury the evidence under more blood. Tobias moved without speaking, crossing the room to the fireplace and taking down the rifle he hadn't used in years. His fingers checked the chamber with the ease of muscle memory. Behind him, the women didn't flinch. They had seen enough rifles to know the difference between threat and readiness. Tobias wasn't threatening them. He was waking up. For a moment, he stood still with the rifle in hand, caught between instincts that had warred inside him for years. Solitude had become armor, but armor was useless against ghosts. Sarah's voice echoed in his mind, not as a memory, but like breath still warm in his ear. "Kindness," she used to say, "is what separates us from the animals." She had believed in mercy, even when the world didn't deserve it, and he had loved her for that, even if he could never be like her. But Sarah was gone, and Tobias had built his life around that absence. Still, that voice remained, haunting him, urging him to listen. He looked around the cabin, now full of people who carried wounds he could not yet name, and in each pair of eyes, he saw something that reminded him of the morning he buried his family. Not just grief, but the hunger to live beyond it. The same hunger that had once burned in him before the world turned cold. "There's a cellar," he said aloud, almost surprising himself. "Stone walls, hidden entrance beneath the kitchen. It's tight, but it might hold all of you." Ayana's eyes met his with quiet appreciation, but then, to his surprise, she shook her head. "No. If they search and find us, you die with us. If they find your home empty but marked by signs of others, they might believe you were not involved." Tobias almost laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "8 years too late for that conversation," he said. "Lady, I became their enemy the day I decided to live past what they did to my family." Her gaze sharpened, not in judgment but in understanding. Perhaps, for the first time, they stood on the same ground. Both had survived something unspeakable. Both had chosen to keep breathing. And now, that simple act of refusing to die had made them enemies to men who thrived on silence. Outside, the storm began to weaken. The pounding rain softened to a steady whisper. Thunder rolled away in the distance like a retreating army. And with that, the veil that had protected them began to lift. Tobias stepped toward the door again, pressing his ear to the wood. Far off, so faint it could be mistaken for wind, he heard the squelch of hooves in wet earth. Not just one rider, multiple. Slow, deliberate, no shouting, no chaos, professionals. He moved to the window and peered through a thin crack in the shutter. The darkness beyond his fence was impenetrable, but he knew they were out there, waiting, watching. They hadn't moved in yet because they believed their prey was already cornered. That was the advantage, that illusion. But illusions only last until someone makes a move. Tobias turned back to the women, who were still near the fire, tending wounds and comforting each other in silence. They looked like survivors, not soldiers, and that made them even more dangerous. He watched as one of the younger women unwrapped a crude bandage from her arm and began cleaning the wound with an old flask of spirits. Another woman gently removed a splinter from her sister's palm while murmuring in their native tongue. These were not helpless refugees. They were tired, yes, weathered by the run, battered by the storm, but Tobias could see it now. Beneath the layers of exhaustion and trauma was steel. These women had not stumbled onto his porch by chance. They had made it here, somehow, through 3 days of pursuit and terror, because they still believed in surviving, still believed in choosing life, and that meant they were already further down the road than Tobias had ever dared walk since burying his own. In that realization, something shifted in him again. Not pity, but respect. Not obligation, but alignment. Maybe they hadn't come to his ranch seeking a savior. Maybe they'd come to remind him of who he used to be. They won't stop, Ayanna said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. She stood now by the hearth, the flames painting her face in flickering gold. If we run, they follow. If we hide, they search until they find us. But if we end it here tonight, the hunting stops. Tobias looked down at his rifle, then back at her. The logic was brutal, but sound. He had always thought of survival as endurance. But maybe it was also confrontation. Maybe it was choosing when and where to stand your ground. "What do you need from me?" he asked, his voice steady. Ayanna didn't smile, but her eyes warmed slightly. When Captain Morrison comes, he expects to find frightened women. He expects a house of silence, of easy prey. But when his men see a white rancher standing beside Apache, they will hesitate. She took a step forward, and that hesitation will cost them everything. Tobias nodded. The fire inside him had been cold for years, but tonight it burned again. Tobias had expected to see fear shaking hands, wide eyes, silent prayers whispered into the fire, but what he saw instead froze him in place. Ayanna no longer looked like a desperate woman fleeing death. She stood upright, shoulders square, and in her hand was a knife small, sharp, and gleaming with more than just firelight. Her stance was balanced, practiced, not the posture of someone holding a weapon for the first time. Around the room, the others shifted subtly, and Tobias's trained eyes caught the changes. One woman moved to block the window. Another adjusted the cloth around her waist, and Tobias saw the glint of metal hidden beneath it. These women weren't just survivors. They were ready, like wolves wearing sheep's wool. They had let him believe they were broken only long enough to get inside. But now that the door was closed, the truth stepped out of the shadows. This wasn't a group in need of saving. This was a war party in waiting. Ayanna caught his stare and held it. "You are not helpless," Tobias said quietly, the realization heavy on his tongue. "We never were," she answered. Her voice wasn't defensive, it was direct, honest, carrying the weight of hard decisions and long battles. But sometimes it's better to let men believe what they wish to believe. She didn't say it with bitterness. She said it like a strategist explaining the final move in a game already half won. Tobias looked around the cabin again, this time with a soldier's eye. Each woman had already chosen a position. Each movement had purpose. There was no panic, only readiness. And in that moment, Something strange and familiar stirred in him, not doubt, but admiration. These were not cornered animals, they were coiled, prepared to strike, and they had chosen this ground, this storm, this exact moment for a reason. They hadn't stumbled onto his land by chance. They'd come here on purpose, and now he understood they'd brought the fight to his doorstep. "How many men have you killed?" Tobias asked. The question wasn't judgment, it was clarity. Ayanna didn't look away. Enough to know that Captain Morrison's men are not the first to underestimate Apache women, and they will not be the last, but they may be the most surprised. Her answer was cold steel wrapped in cloth. There was no bravado in her tone, only fact. Tobias nodded once. That was all he needed to hear. These women had been running. Yes, but not out of fear, out of calculation, and now they had chosen to stop running. Tobias knew the look of a person who decided to make a stand. He'd worn it once, years ago, and tonight it stared back at him through Ayanna's eyes. The storm outside may have soaked their skin, but it had not washed away their purpose. These women were not here to beg. They were here to finish what someone else had started. And Tobias had just become part of it. Outside, the rain had lessened, but the night remained thick with danger. The wind still whispered through the shutters, carrying with it the distant sound of movement, boots in mud, horses shifting in their tack, men murmuring orders. Tobias moved to the window again, pulling the shutter open just a fraction. In the distance, barely visible through the dying storm, torchlight danced low along the ridge. He counted at least 6, maybe more. Not villagers, not bounty hunters, soldiers. Professional, silent, and methodical. He could tell by how they moved, how they circled, how they waited. These men weren't used to being challenged. They were used to compliance, fear, surrender. But tonight, they were walking into a house that didn't hold victims, it held vengeance. Tobias turned back toward Ayanna, who was already moving. Her steps, light and silent. She joined him at the window without a word. "The one by the barn," she whispered. "That's Sergeant Blake. He was there when they killed my husband. The one near your well," she continued, her voice now just breath. "That's Corporal Hayes. He held my sister down while Morrison—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Tobias felt a slow, familiar burn rise in his chest. Not fury, something colder. Purpose. He didn't need to ask any more questions. What these men had done, and what Ayanna's women had survived, was no longer theoretical. The names had faces. The crimes had witnesses. And justice, long delayed, now stood sharpening her blade in Tobias Redmont's living room. These weren't soldiers anymore. They were predators in uniform, and predators only understood one language: consequence. Tobias turned back toward the mantel, checking his rifle once more. It felt solid in his hands, but heavier somehow. Not with weight, but with responsibility. For the first time in 8 years, he would raise it not to defend his solitude, but to protect something bigger, something that might live beyond the storm. "We have a cellar beneath the kitchen," Tobias said. "Stone walls, hidden entrance. It could hide you all." Ayanna shook her head without hesitation. "If we hide and they find us, you die with us. If they find an empty house with signs of people, they might believe you were uninvolved." Tobias snorted. "Too late for that. Lady, I became the army's enemy the day I survived their mercy." She paused, searching his face. Then something flickered in her eyes, surprise. Maybe. Or recognition. the kind that passed between survivors who didn't need words to understand each other. "So, what's your plan?" she asked. Tobias walked toward a cabinet in the far corner, pulling out a box of ammunition. "First, we make them think this is going to be easy. Let them come close. Let them knock." Ayana's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile. Then, we show them what happens when prey bites back." The fire crackled behind them as Ayana moved closer. She handed Tobias a small item, flat, metal, polished, a signal mirror, confessional, and battleground all at once. Federal investigators entered under raised hands. The lieutenant, shaking, stood before them and spoke. He told of what Morrison had done, of what his father had authorized, of the lies they'd been fed, of the raid that ended with women tied to posts and children buried in ash. The investigators listened in stunned silence, scribbling notes, their eyes wide with disbelief. Outside, Colonel Bradley was disarmed without a fight, too stunned, too broken. His son's words had done what bullets couldn't. They led Bradley away in chains before sunrise. His uniform was still pressed, but his reputation was already in ruins. One of the marshals offered Ayana a letter of protection, federal sanctuary for her people. Reparations were promised. Safety, too. None of it would bring back their dead, but it was something. A beginning. Ayana took the paper, but said nothing. Her eyes watched the sunrise through broken shutters. Sometimes justice didn't come in a single night. Sometimes it arrived in pieces, gritty, painful, and incomplete, but still worth taking. Tobias stood by the cabin's ruined doorway, looking out across the land he no longer recognized. His home burned, battered, broken. But for the first time in years, it wasn't empty. 2 babies had survived the night. So had something else his purpose. Ayana walked to him, wrapped in a blanket, her blade finally sheathed. "What will you do?" she asked. Tobias stared west, toward the distant hills. "Build again. Somewhere else. For someone else." She nodded. "Mary Hendricks will need protection. The road to Denver isn't kind to women with infants." Tobias understood. His first act as a free man wouldn't be escape, it would be escort. The Apache women prepared to ride north, toward family, toward survival, toward something that might one day feel like peace. Ayana mounted last. She turned once more to Tobias. "You should know," she said, voice low. "We didn't come to your door because it was closest. We came because of who you were before, and because some of us believed you were still in there." Tobias said nothing at first, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "I thought I was finished." Ayana offered him the faintest smile. "You were just beginning." The sun climbed higher over Tobias Redmont's land, casting gold across ash and blood, across broken walls and new roads. As the women disappeared into the trees and Tobias saddled a horse for the ride west, a new story began, one written not in silence, but in the lives that had been saved. Years later, folks would speak of the night 10 Apache women and 1 forgotten rancher stood against an army and won. But those who had lived it knew better. It wasn't about victory, it was about choice, and sometimes the only choice that matters is to stay human. The cabin stood empty now. What remained of it, charred beams, shattered glass, claw marks from men and storms alike, was no longer a home, but a monument. Not to destruction, but to decision. The earth around it still bore the scars of that night, blackened footprints in the mud, blood dried in the cracks of stone, and a faint line where the water would have rushed had another choice been made. But the dam had held, and so had Tobias Redmont. Days passed, then weeks. Travelers who passed the old trail spoke of the ruins with reverence. Some said a ghost lived there, an old rancher who'd once fought 100 soldiers with nothing but a rifle and a promise. Others said he'd vanished into the west, leading a woman and her child through hostile lands with nothing more than his grit and a quiet kind of grace. No one ever really knew, but all agreed that something had changed that night on Redmont's Ridge. Ayana's people found safety in the Northern Territories. Federal marshals kept their word at least for a time, and the land that had once burned with hatred began to breathe again. Mary Hendricks reached Denver with her daughter, and sometimes when folks gathered at the trading post, she would tell the story. Not the one about Morrison or Bradley, but the one about the man who didn't pull the trigger, the man who chose mercy over vengeance, fire over flood, life over silence. And Tobias. No one saw him build a new home. No one watched him hammer the first nail or dig the first fence post. But fences did appear far to the west, near a bend in the river where the soil ran dark and fertile. A barn rose, slow and sturdy, and beside it, one morning, a child's laughter echoed across the prairie. Not his child, but one he had helped protect. Some nights, when the wind blew right, Tobias would sit by a fire and stare into it, not haunted, but remembering, not lost, but marked. He'd been a ghost once, a man hiding from his own heartbeat, but in opening his door, he'd opened something deeper, a path back to being human. Years later, around other fires in other lands, people would whisper about that night, 10 Apache women, one broken man, and the army that underestimated them all. But those who truly understood knew the truth was simpler. Sometimes it only takes one door opening to change the shape of justice. Sometimes the quietest man carries the loudest truth. And sometimes being human is the most defiant act of all.